project, this little mini project, we'll go over for loops, if statements, strings, and treating strings kind of like arrays. So it's going to be really JavaScript heavy. Is there anything specific that you guys want me to emphasize more or focus on? Maybe you're having trouble with for loops or if statements or anything like that. Any requests?
No, not right now.
Okay. So I'll go ahead and jump in. It's going to be interactive, so I'll ask questions. You guys can kind of just jump in, answer the questions. If you have a question, feel free to interrupt me and just ask the question. Feel free to unmute yourself and ask the question. I'll do about 20 minutes of coding, and then 10 minutes I'll open the floor up and you guys can ask away. All right, so we'll go ahead and get started. So I wrote out some code that essentially some HTML and CSS that creates a text box and has a button. What we're going to do is we're going to add JavaScript functionality to this so that whatever I type in here, once I click this, it's going to tell me the number of spaces. So 1, 2, 3, 4. Once I click this, down here, it should say there are 4 spaces. So we're going to write the JavaScript code that will allow that to happen. All right. So here we have the HTML and we have the CSS that I pre-wrote, but we're mainly going to focus on JavaScript. So the first thing that we want to do in this problem is grab that user information, right? So whatever is typed in here, I want to grab those words in order for me to count the total number of spaces. So what do you think we need in order to do that? What concepts covered in the curriculum do you think would help us in this situation?
The document.getID.
Perfect. So what we're going to do is we're going to create a variable. Can you guys see the code all right? Does it need to be bigger?
That's good on my end.
Okay. All right, so I'm going to create a variable called user text, and I am going to grab this text area element. So how we do that is we use DOM manipulation, and basically we grab the HTML document, which is why we write document. Then once we're in the document, we need to grab an element in this document. So we're going to get element by ID. Okay, so in order for me to grab an element by its ID, it means that the element actually has to have an ID, which this one does, ID text. Perfect. So now I'm going to have my parentheses and I'm going to write the text ID in there, which is text. Okay.
A quick question.
Yeah.
I just noticed that when I'm coding, sometimes it's double quotes and sometimes it's single quotes. Does that really matter?
In some languages it does. For JavaScript, it does not.
Okay, cool.
So here we're grabbing the text, and what this is going to do, this line of code right here, it's going to grab the entire element, including the opening and closing tags. So one trick that I like to show students when they're starting out is when you're writing out your code in VS Code, you may not know what you're typing and what that it's going to equal to, or maybe you think it's going to be one thing and it turns out to be another thing. One thing you can do to be sure is use your inspection tools. So you just right-click the browser and click inspect. And then you go to the second tab where it says console, and you can write out code here. So if I wrote out that same code, right? var text equals document get element by ID text, and I type in text, we see that it grabs that entire element. I don't want that entire element. I just want what's inside of there. So in order for us to grab that, we're grabbing the value of that element, which is why we're doing dot value. So now user text is equal to whatever the user has typed in that text area. Any questions on this line of code?
No.
All right. So here we have our user input. Now we want to count the total number of spaces in this text. So what do we need to do in order to do that? How are we going to approach this problem? What do we need in order, what do we know and what do we need to know about this problem?
We want to count like just the spaces like in between the words.
Mm-hmm.
So we would need to create a for loop, I'm assuming, and then maybe an if statement inside that. It's going to be like, if text is here, then nothing. And then if it's a blank space, then add the counter.
Exactly. So with what you said, we're going to need a for loop, we're going to need an if statement, and we're going to need something to keep track of our spaces. And we normally call it a counter. So we can, I'm just going to call it spaces. That's going to be our counter. Since we haven't started counting yet, we start off at 0, right? I haven't started counting any spaces, so we're going to leave that at 0. So now we're going to go ahead and create this for loop. And what is this loop looping through exactly?
Whatever text is in the text field.
Right, so it's the text, but more specifically, we're going to loop through every single character in that text. So if I said hello, I'm going to look at the H, I'm going to look at the E, the L, the O. So we're looking at every single character. And you can kind of think of it as like an array. So an array has all of its different elements, right? So we can treat this string as if it was an array of characters. That's how you can kind of think of it when you're looping through it. So let's go ahead and set up the for loop. So first thing we need to do is we need to declare an index that's going to keep track of where we are in the loop. So I'm going to use I, you can use whatever you like. And I'm going to start off at 0 because just like in arrays, when you start off at that first element, you're looking at index 0. So we're going to do 0. And then what's going to be our stopping point? How can we figure out, okay, we're done looking at this text?
Maybe like when you have multiple blank spaces in like conjunction to each other. Or
So,
can you do like a dot length and figure out like the whole length of it? Yeah. Okay, cool.
Yep. That's where I was headed at. So we can figure out the total length of the string just by using the dot length method, right? And once it hits that number, we know that there are no more characters in this array. So we do I less than user text dot length. Okay. And then we want to go, once we look at one character, we want to go on to the next character. So we're going to iterate I by 1. So plus plus. Plus plus just means we're adding 1 to that variable. So if I is 0 and we do plus plus, it is now 1. All right, so we have our for loop set up. It's going to go through every single character in this text. So now that we are looking at every single character in the text, what do we want to do with that information?
You want to set up an if-else statement.
Right. So let's set up this if statement. And what are we looking at? What are we, if what?
If the character is not equal to a space, then you would move forward. And then else, if the character is equal to a space, you would add 1 to the counter.
Yep, we can totally do it that way, but we can even make it shorter and just check to see if it's a space, right? Because all we care about is the spaces. So we can do user text, and since it's a string and we're treating it like an array, we can use the array notation and look at user text at index I, okay? And we're comparing it to the space character. Okay, so we're looking at this character and we're saying, hey, is it a space? If it is, then what do I want to do?
Add one to the counter.
Yep, so we can do spaces plus plus, right? So now we are going through here, and if it's not equal to a space, it will just continue on with the loop. It will just move on to the next index number, and we'll just look at every single character and see if it's space. So now that's taken care of. We've gone through everything. We checked to see all the spaces. If it was a space, we counted that, okay? So now the next thing that we want to do is we want to display how many spaces we just counted, right? So in order to do that, we need to grab the element that we want to put this information in. So I have written H3 element right here with an ID of result. So first thing we want to do is we want to grab the element. So we do document dot get element by ID. And then our ID this time is result. And now, instead of grabbing the value, we're going to grab something called the inner HTML. Inner HTML is anything that is in between an opening and closing tag. So this right here, workshop April 5th, that is the inner HTML of the title element. Right, this text right here, please write in the text box below, is the inner HTML of the H1 element, and so on and so forth. Right now, there's no text in between the opening and closing H3 tag. Doesn't mean the inner HTML doesn't exist, it just means there's nothing in there. So we want to grab the inner HTML and we want to set that equal to something because we want to put something there so it does display when we click that button. So I'm just going to write a little string here. There are, and then I'm going to add spaces. So whenever you add a variable or another string to a string, it's just going to make it one big string. So there are spaces. Then I have to write spaces in this text. So if I counted 4, we have there are 4 spaces in this text. Okay, so we have all the JavaScript that we need, right, to get everything going. But the last thing we need to do is we need to connect this button to this JavaScript. How is this button going to know, hey, once I'm clicked, we're going to go ahead and execute all this code? Does anyone know what attribute we could use with button to make that happen?
Would you give the button an ID and then add an event listener in the JavaScript code?
Yeah, you could definitely do it that way, or you can use the Onclick attribute, and I can show you both ways on how to do it. So if you did an ID, and let's say we called it button, right? Then what you could do is grab this button. So I'm just going to create a variable button and do document get element by ID, and then the ID is button. And so now I have the whole element, right? I have that whole button. So now with the button, I'm going to add an event listener, and I'm going to listen for a click, okay? And then I can perform a function. So let's say with this, let's call our function count spaces. Okay, so now with this, the event listener is going to listen for a click. So once this button is clicked, we're going to perform the function count spaces. So that means we need to create a function called count spaces. And basically all we're going to do is wrap all this code inside this function. Oops. I'm real anal about alignment, so here we go. So this is one way that we could do it, right? So let's go ahead and test it out. So 1, 2, 3, 4. I should expect 4. All right, so it did it on, didn't like that. So what we need to do is do a window on load. So what happened right now is that it automatically executed this code as soon as the page loaded. So what you have to do is you have to wait for the whole page to load in order for this to happen. So window on load. See, I need to look up the syntax on this one because I always forget. No, wrong one. And searching on Google for code takes a certain finesse to get exactly what you're looking for. Yeah, there it is. All right. Yeah, I'm just going to move all of this inside of here. And the thing about using window onload and addEventListener is that once it does it for the first time, you have to reinitiate your variables. So you have to set spaces back equal to 0. Because otherwise it will keep it the exact same as the first time that you did it. So let's go ahead and try it this way. Still not working. Let's see what's going on here. I am going to change this count spaces to just a function. And I'm going to move all of this up here. And then let me just make sure that my curly brackets are matching. There we go. All right, let's try it this way. End of put. Right, so we got a syntax error here. If anyone sees something I'm not, just feel free to shout out. Let's see. This is closing that. Then you close this curly bracket over here. There we go. All right, there we go. So we got it to work with the addEventListener. So with addEventListener, you have to use the window.onload because if you saw the first time that I did it, it just said 0. That's because it just ran it as soon as that page first started loading. So we have to wait for the whole page to load. So that's why we use the window.onload. And then when it's done loading, it's going to perform a function. And that function is that code to grab the button and then add an event listener to that button. And then what I did to manipulate it here is that we're listening for a click. And once that click is done, we're going to perform a function. And that function is all of this right here, which is the code that we initially started writing. But when you are using addEventListener, you have to reinitialize your spaces, because otherwise it's going to stay with 4 no matter what you put in. Or like if the first one counts to 4 spaces, then no matter what you do, it's 4 spaces, 4 spaces, 4 spaces. So that's how you can do it with the event listener. Another way that you can do it is using the Onclick attribute. So if we were to do it with Onclick, I'll just have 2 versions of the code so you guys can have both versions. And I will post the code under the announcements so you guys can see. All right, so with Onclick, the attribute is, hey, when you click this button, go ahead and perform this JavaScript function. So you need to set it equal to a JavaScript function. So I'm going to call it count spaces. And that means here I need a function called count spaces. And then I am just going to copy this code right here, that original code that we wrote. And then I will comment this out. So now with this, when I click this button, we're going to go to count spaces in my JavaScript. It's going to jump to my JavaScript, look for count spaces, and then perform that function. So let's do it this way. Refresh. Get the same result. So there are numerous ways that you can approach one problem. One way isn't more right than the other way. We just want to get the task done. So that's all I have for you guys. Do you have any questions on any of the code I wrote? If statements, for loops, variables, event listener, things of that nature?
How do you select multiple lines of code and comment them all out at the same time?
Yeah, so do you have a Mac or a Windows?
Mac.
Okay, so highlight everything, and then you're gonna hit Command // So you can uncomment things out or you can comment things out.
Okay.
And it's you just do that and it does it for the language. So you don't have to memorize all the syntax for comments on all the different languages. Because I do not have time to write this whole thing. That's insane. Any other questions about VS Code, tricks, anything like that?
How would you be able to do it for Windows?
For Windows, it's going to be Control // Everyone feel good about what I just showed you guys?
Yeah.
Awesome. Well, we have about 5 more minutes left. So if there's a burning question that you want to ask, feel free to ask it. I'm sure someone else has it and they just don't want to ask it either.
I got a question that's somewhat off topic a little bit.
Okay.
Are we ever going to go over, like, I think like lesson 9 was like terminal and source code, and it went over like GitHub and Kraken and everything, like the integration. A lot of that, not a lot of it, but I would say a decent portion of it was somewhat confusing. Are we ever going to have a time where we can go over that? Or is that something that I could better like partner with you in like your office hours and ask you questions on?
So both. Tomorrow's workshop that I have is in the morning, or is it is that one? I forget what time it is. You can You can check the link to see what my next workshop is. That next workshop is going to go over terminal and source control. So every workshop is going to be just like a 30-minute session, and it's a different topic every time. So mine tomorrow is going to be terminal and source control. So if you can make it, please join. If you can't, it will be recorded and it will be posted. So you do have access to see those workshops if you cannot see them. So also, you can also just come to my office hours. You can sign up for my office hours, and we can have that one-on-one time where I can, help you walk through it.
Okay. So since you said every workshop is going to be like a different topic, should we sign up for like as many workshops as we're available for?
Yes, definitely.
Okay.
Yeah. So it'll be different every time. So I'll never do the same thing again.
And then one last question. I know like the curriculum in Exeter is like, I'm doing like the final project right now for like that first section that we had. When is that going to change and we're going to go into like the next section?
Are you a WazU student?
Yes.
Okay. When was it the 19th? When did you start?
I believe so. Is it just like the deadline that's posted on the Exeter program?
Yeah, so it's 3 weeks per course. So then on Sunday is when this current course finishes. And then on Monday, you'll get your next course, which is front-end foundations.
Okay, cool. Just curious.
So every 3 weeks on that Monday, the new material will load into and sometimes it's on Friday. So you might want to check on the weekend to see, and you can get a jump start to see, kind of get an overview of the material, but definitely by Monday. If for whatever reason you do not have the material by Monday, please let me know, so I can let the registrar know that you haven't been enrolled.
Okay, cool.
All right. Well, if there are no more questions, I want to thank you guys so much for coming today. This is recorded and it will be posted by the end of the day. And I will also post the code as well, so you can have that for your reference.
Cool. Thank you.
You're welcome. Have a great day.
Thank you. Thank you.